The morning they came for the general, the air tasted of burnt rubber and distant rain. Captain Alara Vance was not in the command center, where the panic was thickening like tar. She was in the motor pool, her hands deep in the guts of a crippled armored vehicle, her knuckles scraped raw on twisted metal. The radio on her hip crackled with static-laced chaos, code phrases for a compromised perimeter for a fallen leader. She pulled her hands from the engine bay, oil staining her fingers like war paint, and listened. The words "Valkyrie is down" meant nothing to the new recruits, but to Alara, they were a cold knife to the heart. General Soraya Mbeki, the architect of their resistance, the woman who had pulled a broken nation from the ashes, was cut off behind enemy lines. The official rescue mission was already being scrambled, a conventional extraction with gunships and rangers. But as Alara stared at the map in her mind, tracing the river valleys and the jagged teeth of the Iron Ridge, she knew what the commanders would not admit. The textbook rescue was a death warrant. The enemy would be waiting for that. They would have anti-air nests dug into the high passes and ambushes seated along every approach road. They had planned for the generals of war, but had they planned for a mechanic? She wiped her hands on a rag, the decision settling in her bones with a terrifying calm. The fighters of the Eastern Legion couldn't stop her because they would never see her coming. She was going in alone. Alara's plan lived in the forgotten places of the war. She did not go to the armory for a high-tech rifle. She took the old, bolt-action hunting gun from her locker, its stock worn smooth by her father's hands. She didn't request a fast-attack vehicle. She went to the graveyard of machines behind the motor pool, to the skeleton of a civilian cargo truck deemed beyond repair. For 6 hours, as the base thrummed with the furious energy of the failing main rescue, Alara worked in a bubble of eerie silence. She welded scavenged armor plates onto the truck's cab, not to make it impervious, but to make it look like a ramshackle, fortified vehicle used by the local warlords. She mixed mud and rust pigment, aging her repairs instantly. Her map was not digital, but a paper one, annotated with notes from a year ago. Goat herder trails, seasonal riverbeds now dry, the location of a spring that never appeared on satellite imagery. She left at dusk, a solitary figure in a battered truck, rolling past the sentries with forged papers declaring her a medical courier for a neutral aid group. The real rescue mission, a fleet of helicopters, thundered overhead minutes later, racing toward their fate. Alara turned east, away from the noise, and vanished into the gathering dark. The first leg was through the semi-controlled territory, where checkpoints were manned by bored, young soldiers. At each one, she played her part, a weary driver, a woman out of her depth, offering them stolen cigarettes, and a story about delivering antibiotics to a frontier clinic. Her plain face, etched with grease and fake worry, raised no alarms. But once she crossed the ruined bridge at Curson's Bend, she was in the wildlands, a contested maze of canyons and scrubland patrolled by Eastern Legion fighters. Her progress became a dance with the landscape. She drove without headlights, navigating by the faint glow of a crescent moon and her intimate knowledge of the terrain. When the growl of a motorcycle patrol echoed against the canyon walls, she killed the engine and rolled the truck into a shallow ravine, covering it with a dusty camouflage net. She lay still among the rocks as two fighters passed within 20 feet, their flashlight beams slicing the air above her head. Their conversation, snippets about the big catch and the hellebirds they had shot down, confirmed her darkest fears. The official rescue had failed. She was the only one left moving toward the general. The weight of that knowledge was a physical anchor, but she used it, letting it press her closer to the cold, safe earth until the sound of the engines faded into the night. The crash site was not a location. It was a wound in the mountain. Alara abandoned the truck 3 miles out, hiding it in a cave formed by a rock slide. She continued on foot, her hunting rifle slung across her back, a small pack of medical supplies and dried food on her hips. The smell reached her first, acrid smoke, fuel, and the underlying scent of burnt pine. Then came the sounds, the crackle of a dying fire, and the rough voices of Eastern Legion fighters stationed as a perimeter guard. They were celebrating, their posture relaxed. They believed the threat was over. Alara became a shadow, using every rock and stunted tree for cover. She counted 12 guards, their attention focused inward on the smoldering wreckage of the general's command helicopter. The general was not in it. Alara's eyes scanned the cliffs, the tree line. A faint, unnatural gleam caught her eye, a piece of fuselage, smaller, further down the slope. The general's escort bird, moving with a patience that felt like a separate heartbeat. She circled the entire area, finding a path down a treacherous, near-vertical scree slope the guards had deemed impassable. Stones clattered under her boots, the noise masked by the laughter of the enemy. At the bottom, half buried in a thicket of thorny bushes, was the secondary wreck. And there, propped against a shattered rotor assembly, was General Soraya Mbeki. Her left arm was clearly broken, bound in a makeshift sling from a torn uniform sleeve. A gash on her forehead had bled down the side of her strong, composed face. But her eyes, when they snapped toward the rustling in the bushes, were fierce and alert, a pistol held steady in her good hand. The moment stretched, recognition dawning. Alara put a finger to her lips. She approached slowly, not as a soldier to a commander, but as one survivor to another. She didn't salute. She simply knelt, offered a canteen, and in a whisper that was barely a breath, laid out the brutal truth. The main extraction failed. The ridge is crawling with patrols hunting for you. I have a route out. It will be hard. Can you walk? The general studied the grease-stained face, the ordinary rifle, the utterly extraordinary fact of her presence here, alone. A ghost of a smile touched the general's lips. She took the canteen. "Captain Vance," she whispered back, "I thought you were still fixing my Jeep." The rescue, against all odds, had begun. The journey out was a descent into a different kind of warfare. This was not about firefights, but about silence, stillness, and a crushing patience. Alara knew they could not outrun the hunters. They had to become ghosts. She supported the general, whose strength was formidable but waning from pain and blood loss. They moved only at night, following waterways to hide their scent and tracks. During the day, they hid in places no one would choose. A rancid badger set, the crumbling cavity of a deadfall, once submerged up to their necks in the foul water of a stagnant pond as a patrol passed meters away. Alara treated the general's wounds with field dressings, splinting the arm properly with a piece of driftwood and strips from her own shirt. They spoke in whispers. The general spoke of strategy, of the fragile coalition back home. Alara spoke of terrain, of pressure points and engines, of how to listen to the land. A mutual respect, forged in the mud, and fear began to blur the lines of rank. The crisis came on the third night. They were skirting the edge of a Legion outpost, a nest of activity with generators humming, when a trip flare Alara hadn't seen was triggered. Blinding white light erupted, painting them like statues. Shouts erupted. Alara didn't think. She shoved the general behind a dense thicket, turned, and fired her rifle not at the men, but at the fuel drums beside the generator shack. The shot was a gamble in the dark, but the whump of igniting diesel rewarded her. A fireball climbed into the sky, casting chaotic shadows and creating instant confusion. In the pandemonium, she grabbed the general, and they ran, not away from the outpost, but directly through its periphery, using the smoke and screams as their cloak. They stumbled into the cold waters of the river Silt and let the current carry them for a mile before dragging themselves onto the far bank, shivering and exhausted. The general looked at Alara, her face illuminated by the distant glow of the burning outpost. "That," she said through chattering teeth, "was not in any manual I ever read." Alara simply nodded, checking her rifle. They had just used the enemy's strength, their numbers, their base, against them. The hunters were now disorganized and looking in the wrong direction. The final miles were a test of pure will. The general's fever spiked, infection setting into her wounds. Alara half carried her, their progress slowing to a painful shuffle. The Eastern Legion, stung and furious, had widened their search, but they were looking for a military unit, not a lone woman carrying another on her back. Alara's chosen exit was not toward the friendly lines, which were now a fortified wall expecting an assault, but through the impassable wetlands of the Black Marsh. It was a place of sucking mud, biting insects, and treacherous pools. To the Legion, it was a natural barrier. To Alara, who had mapped its solid islands and deer trails, it was a backdoor. For a full day and night, they waded through the chilling muck. Alara used her last reserves of strength to keep the general's head above water, to pull her from grasping silt holes, to whisper stories of a peaceful home she hadn't seen in years. They were no longer captain and general. They were Soraya and Alara, two women refusing to let the war have the final word. As dawn broke on the fifth day, the sky a watery gray, they crawled out of the reeds on a solid, high ground. Ahead, through a morning mist, was the ragged outline of an Alliance watchtower. An alarm sounded. A hesitant, questioning shout echoed through a bullhorn. Alara stood, using her body as a shield for the woman behind her. She raised her empty hands, then, slowly, carefully pulled a tattered, sodden flag from her pack, the resistance standard. She waved it once, a feeble flutter of color against the gray, before her legs finally gave way. They were found by stunned, young sentries who could not believe their eyes. The news traveled up the chain of command like lightning. The general, alive, brought back not by special forces but by the quiet mechanic from the motor pool. In the medical tent, as doctors fussed over them, Soraya Mbeki reached out and gripped Alara's muddy, torn hand. Her voice was weak but clear. "You didn't just rescue a general, Alara. You showed an army that the enemy's greatest weapon is our own expectation. They can't stop what they don't understand." The story would spread, of course, growing in the telling. But, at its heart, it remained a simple, profound truth. Sometimes, the most powerful force in a war is not a squadron of fighters, but one stubborn, ingenious person who knows a different way home. The enemy fighters couldn't stop her because they never saw the war through her eyes. The days after the rescue were a strange new world for Alara Vance. She was used to the smell of oil and the sound of engines. Now she was surrounded by the quiet rustle of papers and the low voices of officers in the command bunker. The general had ordered her to be part of the debriefing, not as a witness, but as a planner. Alara sat in a corner of the room, her clean uniform feeling stiff and wrong. The high command officers pointed at maps with laser pointers. They talked about troop movements and counterattacks. They wanted to launch a big offensive to punish the Eastern Legion for the attack on the general. It was a plan built on anger and pride. Alara listened, her eyes tracing the lines on the big map on the wall. She saw the arrows pointing toward the enemy strongholds. She saw the same old routes, the same predictable valleys. She remembered the motorcycle patrol, the hidden trails, the blind spots in the marsh. These men were planning to fight the war the enemy expected. A heavy feeling settled in her stomach. It would cost many lives, and it might not even work. General Soraya Mbeki, her arm in a proper cast now, watched the room. She saw Alara's quiet discomfort. When the senior officer finished his plan, the room was quiet, waiting for the general's approval. "Captain Vance," the general said, her voice cutting through the silence. "You have been quiet. You have walked this ground recently. What do your eyes see on this map?" Every officer in the room turned to look at Alara. She felt her face grow warm. She was a captain. These were colonels and generals. She stood up slowly and walked to the map. She pointed not at the enemy forts, but at the empty spaces between them. "The Eastern Legion is strong here, and here," she said, her voice rough from lack of use. "They're waiting for us to come these ways. Their anti-air guns are here in the high passes. Their supplies come on this road from the north." She moved her finger, tracing a winding, broken line that went off the main map. "But their strength makes them blind. They think some places cannot be used. The Black Marsh, the old riverbeds that are dry now, the goat paths on the western cliffs. They do not guard these places because they think tanks and trucks cannot pass. A coronel snorted. Because they cannot. We need supply lines. We need heavy armor to break their walls. Goat paths are useless for a real army. Alara looked at him, then back at the general. We do not need to break their walls. We need to make their walls useless. She took a deep breath. Do not send the army to their forts. Send small teams like the one I used. Teams that do not need trucks or heavy guns. Teams that can move like the wind. Their job is not to fight, but to break. They hit the supply road here at the narrow bridge. They sabotaged the fuel depot here, near the marsh edge. They blocked the one good road into the high passes with landslides. You cut the head from the body. The forts become prisons. The fighters inside have no food, no fuel, no new bullets. Then your big army does not attack. It just waits. It sits here in a strong defensive line. And you offer them a way out. You offer them surrender with honor because they are not beaten in battle. They are starved by strategy. The room erupted into arguments. Ridiculous. Guerrilla tactics. We are a proper army, not bandits. It is not honorable. General Mbeki held up her good hand. The room fell silent. She looked at Alara, a spark in her eyes that Alara had seen in the wreckage. They said a lone mechanic could not pull a general from behind enemy lines. They were wrong. She turned to the room. We have been fighting their war. Captain Vance is proposing we make them fight ours. A war of patience, not noise. I want a new plan on my desk by dawn. One that uses Captain Vance's maps. You will work with her. And so, Alara found herself in a small room with the planning staff. At first, they were cold to her. But she laid out her paper maps, the ones with her handwritten notes. She showed them the paths. She explained how a team of 10 with knowledge could do more damage than a battalion charging a machine gun nest. Slowly, a young major started asking real questions. An engineer became excited about the idea of using the terrain itself as a weapon. The plan began to take shape. It was not a grand charge. It was a silent, spreading crack. Weeks later, the operation began. It was called Operation Gosong. Alara was not allowed to go on the missions. She was too valuable now as a planner, they said. But she stood on the observation deck as the teams left at night. They wore simple clothes, not standard uniforms. They carried packs of tools and explosives, not big rifles. They moved out in ones and twos, vanishing into the darkness like water into sand. Reports trickled back not through official radio channels, but through coded messages sent by civilians. A bridge on the northern supply road was down, not by bombs, but by the careful removal of key bolts. It would take weeks to fix. A series of small, clever fires destroyed a stockpile of tires and spare parts deep behind enemy lines. The fuel depot was hit not by an airstrike, but by a team that contaminated the fuel with water and dirt, ruining it without a single explosion. The Eastern Legion woke up to 100 small cuts. They tightened security around their forts, but the attacks were not on the forts. They were on the thin, vital lines that connected them to the world. Back at headquarters, the mood changed. The big army sat in its defensive positions, digging in, growing stronger. They dropped leaflets over the enemy forts, showing pictures of the destroyed bridge and the ruined supplies. The message was simple. You are not surrounded by our army. You are surrounded by the land itself. And the land is against you. Alara felt a strange distance from it all. She was a hero in the base. People nodded to her with respect. But she missed the motor pool. She missed the honest problems of broken machines. One evening, she walked away from the command bunker and found her way to her old workshop. Her truck, the one she had used to rescue the general, was still there, still covered in mud and rust. She ran her hand over the fender she had welded. They tell me I should be happy in the war room, a voice said behind her. Alara turned. It was General Mbeki, out of her formal jacket, wearing a simple sweater. General, Alara said, standing straight. Soraya, please. Here in this place, we are just two women looking at a very ugly truck. The general smiled and came to stand beside her. You are uncomfortable with your new role. I'm a mechanic, Alara said simply. I fix things. The planning room. It feels like I'm pulling things apart. Sometimes, to fix a broken clock, you must first take it apart, Soraya said. You have given us a chance to fix this war, to save thousands of lives by being smart, not just strong. That is a different kind of fixing. Do you think it will work? Alara asked, looking at the truck, a symbol of her different way of thinking. It is already working, Soraya said. The first enemy fort has asked for a truce to talk. They have food for 2 more weeks. They see the end. They're choosing to live. That is your victory, Alara. Not a victory of explosion, but of choice. Later that night, a message came for Alara. It was from a young major she had worked with on the plan. He was with one of the ghost teams near the Black Marsh. The message was short. The back door you showed us works. We are in position. The enemy does not look here. Thank you for the map. Alara folded the message and put it in her pocket. She looked out the window at the night sky. The war was not over, but a different path was now being walked. She had rescued the general, and now the general's army was rescuing itself from the old, bloody way of fighting. The enemy fighters could not stop her ideas any more than they could stop her truck, because the idea was simple. Do not fight where the enemy is strong. Make the enemy weak where they think they are safe. It was not a magic trick. It was just seeing the world, not as a soldier, but as a mechanic. And sometimes that was enough.